May God bless this reading. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent.
This is the word of the Lord.
May God give me the strength to do this.
I had to preach on this verse once in a different church. It was simply because, I was rostered on and this verse was rostered on and the two just kind of combined. And I thought, maybe I should just stand up with, duct tape and just, for a little while. Yeah. Look, we forgot one announcement. I've actually got a couple of announcements. Merthyr Road Uniting Church is putting on it's hosting a Lifeline course called Accidental Counsellor. You might have seen this in Slack, or I think it was in the newsletter as well. We have had 7 people already sign up. But if you would like to, it is on Saturday the 7th of June. There's 4 hours, it's 9 till 1, and then there are 2 hours of e-learning that you do in your own time. And it's kind of like mental health first aid. We have got some discounted spots at $120. We actually offered subsidies for the first 6 people and they went like hotcakes. So they've run out, but we've still got discounted spaces at $120. So if you would be interested in doing that, have a look on Slack, have a look in the newsletter, check it out, and then email me and let me know that you'd like to do that and we can organise that. The other thing that I want to say, the board is aware of a couple of incidences that happened last Sunday, and we want the congregation to know that we're going through our safeguarding processes to support the people who were involved and to find ways of avoiding similar incidents in the future. I just want to invite anyone who is feeling unsettled as a result of one of those incidences to come and speak to me, or you can talk to Ryan or Margaret Wheat. We don't want to shut conversation down, but if you are talking to other people about either of these incidents, then just please remember that we are talking about humans and you need to engage your compassion and respect. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that is fantastic because that means you weren't involved, and our ways of working together, number 2, says that we should only involve the people who need to be involved. On with the show. I've had a lovely Mother's Day. We got together, my youngest son and his wife put on this breakfast for us. We had a really fun time. My oldest son, Josh, he's said this several times now since he moved back from the States. He said, "The Powell men have a type. We've all married strong women with attitude." And I look at my 2 daughters-in-law and I think he's right, because none of us are shrinking violets. We all have our own opinions and ways of doing things. You know, the comment that he made says as much about the Powell men in the family as the women in it, because my husband and my 2 sons, they are just very secure in their own sense of who they are, and they're not intimidated by strong women with attitude. And it's one of the many reasons why I admire all 3 of the Powell men in my life. In 1987, a group of American biblical scholars from the Evangelical Theological Society, ETS, they started an organisation called the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. According to their website, the mission of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood is to set forth the teachings of the Bible about the complementary differences between men and women created equally in the image of God, because these teachings are essential for obedience to Scripture and for the health of the family and the church. It was this organisation that coined the term complementarianism. I don't know if you've heard that term or not, but it's the idea that men and women, while equally valued by God, hold different roles in the church and in the family. Specifically, the man is the head of the household and should love his wife unconditionally, while the woman should submit joyfully to his leadership and fetch his slippers. I'm not sure if that was there or not. Perhaps I read that in. In the church, both men and women are encouraged to use their gifts, except that women cannot teach men or serve in the role of pastor or church leader unless they are unmarried overseas missionaries or lecturers in Bible college. There are 2 loopholes there. This council had a very pervasive influence on conservative Christianity in the US and then beyond, because what happens in the US often spreads around the world. And the terms biblical manhood and biblical womanhood became part of the language in conservative Christian circles. And there were books written to promote the idea of a manhood that is biblical or a womanhood that is biblical. And I've read some of those books. I don't know if you have. They leave readers with the vague general impression, without saying it specifically, that a biblical man sort of has a bit of a strong jaw, wears chinos, likes carpentry, mountain climbing, and chowing down appreciatively on his wife's good cooking. He's warm-hearted and generous, but will not tolerate disrespect in this household. And he knows how to make a fire by rubbing 2 sticks together. A biblical woman has clear skin with no acne, never shows cleavage, always looks cheerful, although just a little weary as she chases the little tykes around the backyard. She's always patient, always kind, and never swears when one of those little tykes accidentally jams one of her fingers in the toy box. You can find her waiting adoringly and with just a hint of cheeky seductiveness at the door when her husband arrives home from work. After many long years of sexual purity, aka abstinence, the biblical man and the biblical woman, they get married, they begin an amazing sex life on their wedding night, and soon after that they produce some biblical children whom they parent using biblical parenting. The leaders on the council on biblical manhood and womanhood, they might disagree with my assessment of these books, saying that that's not their message at all. And yet, that's the message that's been perceived by most people that I know who have kind of bumped up against this thinking. Well, to be honest, as I read the statements on the website of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, I started to wonder whether their thoughts on biblical womanhood are actually biblical. And so I thought it might be worthwhile to have a look at biblical womanhood today by looking at some biblical women. And so here's the first. I don't know if you can see that picture well. Her name is Jael. And yes, that is a tent peg that she's about to hammer into a soldier's head. His name is Sisera. And in the story related in Judges 4, he's the commander of a Canaanite army. That's the bad guys. That Barak, a good guy, I knew I was going to need my water. So Barak is the good guy. He's the leader of the Israelites. And these 2 armies are about to fight. Now, despite being outnumbered, the Israelite army defeats the Canaanites. And realising that this is about to happen, Sisera jumps out of his chariot and he runs away. He runs to a nearby tent, and the tent belongs to Jael. She is the wife of an ally of his. And so he's hoping to hide from the pursuing army by hiding in her tent. This is what Judges 4:18 and following says. Jael came out to welcome Sisera. She said to him, "Stop and rest, my lord. Stop and rest with me. Don't be afraid." So Sisera stopped to rest in her tent, and she put a blanket over him. He said to her, you kind of wonder, don't you? Like, what's really going on here? There's a lot of gaps in the biblical narrative that you're encouraged to fill. That's how biblical narrative works. He said to her, "Give me a little water to drink, because I'm thirsty." She opened a goatskin container of milk and gave him some milk to drink. Then she covered him up again. He said to her, "Stand watch at the entrance to the tent. If anyone comes along and asks you, 'Is there a man here?' say, 'No.'" And Jael took a tent peg in one hand and a hammer in the other. She crept up on him, drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground while he was asleep from exhaustion, and he died. Have you heard that story? It's in the Bible. Go look at it. And now that's biblical womanhood in action. Jael is forever remembered for killing the bad guy, the enemy of the Lord God, with a tent peg. Are women everywhere meant to imitate Jael, her heroic actions? I'm thinking about the Hillsong Annual Women's Colour Conference and wondering if it might make a great theme song. Raise your tent peg high. We could be... And we've got Tamar. In the book of Genesis, Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law. Judah was one of the... who was to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Judah is one of those 12. So Tamar was married to Judah's oldest son, but died and left Tamar childless. Now, this is a tragedy in this time and place because it means that the son's name, Er's name, would be lost, and his land may be lost as well. There's no heir to pass it along to. So under the law, this is the law, you can read it in the Old Testament, Judah's next oldest son, Onan, was supposed to have sex with Tamar and give her, and more importantly, her dead husband, a child. So the brother would sleep with Tamar, she would get pregnant, have a child, and that child would be regarded as her husband's child. You see how it works? Take on the husband's land and thus keeps the land in the family. But when Onan slept with her, he spilled his seed on the ground rather than give her a child that would belong to his brother. He did it deliberately so that she wouldn't have a child. And then Onan died too. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my youngest son Shelah grows up." But years later, when Shelah grew up, Tamar was not given to him as his wife. Tamar is now distraught. How can she honour her dead husband if she cannot have a child in his name? One day, her father-in-law Judah goes into town. Tamar covered herself with a veil to disguise herself and pretended to be a sex worker, and then sat down on the side of the road where she knew that Judah would be passing. When Judah saw her, he didn't recognise her and thought she was indeed a sex worker. And so he went over to her and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Now, to guarantee payment, because he didn't have Pay ID on his phone with him, he agreed to leave his staff and his seal with her. Staff is in the thing that you carry. He agreed to leave that with her, kind of like as a guarantee, until he could send a servant later with the money. So Judah slept with her, and she became pregnant. Then she went home and put on her widow's clothes again. Months later, when it was discovered that she was pregnant, Judah was enraged because, as far as he was concerned, she had brought disgrace upon the family, and he orders to have her burned alive. But Tamar produces the staff and said, "I'm pregnant by the man who owns this." Busted. Judah recognised them and realises what's happened, realises what she's done. She has secured a child for her dead husband so that his name would live on, that he would be honoured, and that his land wouldn't be lost to the family. And Judah proclaims, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. Biblical womanhood. Jael celebrated for brutally killing an enemy. Tamar called righteous for sleeping with her father-in-law. Two biblical women. They're both cast in a favourable light in the stories. And yet, the Council on Biblical Manhood and Biblical Womanhood does not hold them up as the standard for biblical womanhood. And that's probably a good idea. There are many, many women in the Bible. Rather than trying to imitate them in order to be a biblical woman, what we're meant to do is reflect on these stories. We're to reflect on their character, reflect on the outcome of the choices that they made, and we're to seek to learn something about what God is like, what people are like, and how the world works through reflecting on these stories. That's the way that stories work in the Bible. And do you know, they rarely spell out whether a character is a good guy or a bad guy, a good girl or a bad girl, or whether they made a wise choice or an unwise choice. Instead, they prompt the reader to chew that over for themselves. So many women. Sarah, she disbelieved and even laughed at God's promise that she and Abraham would have a child post-menopause. She convinced Abraham to sleep with her slave woman to produce a child instead. The daughters of Lot, Abraham's nephew, this deserves a whole sermon in itself. They are offered up by their father to be sexually used by a crazed mob in return for the safety of his house guests. Jezebel convinced her husband, King Ahab, to abandon the worship of Yahweh, and she also persecuted the prophets of Yahweh. She was thrown out the window by her own court entourage and eaten by stray dogs. Ruth, a foreigner who decides to stay faithful to her mother-in-law by converting to her religious faith, and she finds a welcome in her mother-in-law's community. Hannah, childless and in disgrace because of it, prays to God, and God hears her prayer and grants her a child, whom she dedicates back to God to work in the temple. There are many, many women in the Bible. There are women in the Bible who are victims and women in the Bible who are victors. They follow God, they rebel against God. They're wise, they're unwise. They follow expectations, they subvert expectations. So good luck trying to work out what biblical womanhood is from the women that you come across when you read the Bible. The Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, they rely heavily on statements made by Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his letters to various people and churches to decide what biblical womanhood looks like. And you've heard the favourite one already. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. That's the bit that's most often quoted, and it seems quite clear, doesn't it? There's no ambiguity about that bit of the verse. Some will also go on to quote the next verse, Paul's rationale for what he's just said. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived, and she became a transgressor. Some feel a little bit uncomfortable about going with that verse, suggesting that women are more prone to being deceived and falling into sin than men, so sometimes that one doesn't get brought up quite so much. What's almost always left out of the conversation is the next verse. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with modesty. So according to Paul, my salvation's secured. I've had 2 children, but you women out there who have not borne children, I've got news for you, and it's all bad. Much ink has been spilled trying to explain this verse away, trying to explain what Paul meant. And do you know what? No one actually knows. There's something here. It's clear that there's something here that we don't understand. There's probably, most likely, something going on in the background of 1 Timothy that we don't know about, because this statement goes against everything that Paul seems to say about how salvation works elsewhere. The question is, are we supposed to take what Paul says in a letter to a particular church that was dealing with a particular issue at a particular time in a particular culture and apply it to all people everywhere, in all times and all cultures, regardless of whether or not the church is even dealing with that same issue? Because if we're going to do that, we'd better make sure that slaves are obeying their masters, that we drink wine to settle our upset stomach, and that we financially support the widows over 60 in our congregation, because they're all in Paul's letters too. You see, what Paul writes in a letter is always context specific. It may, of course, apply equally to our context too. Paul tells us to bear with one another. And, you know, we have to bear with one another. That's equally applicable everywhere. But, you know, which is which, that's going to take a lot of wisdom to discern. The same goes for every verse that's ever been quoted by the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Another favourite is this one. It's in 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. Women, or it could be wives because it's exactly the same word in the Greek, should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. Rather, let them be in submission, as in fact the law says. If they want to find out about something, they should ask their husbands at home, because it is disgraceful for a woman or wife to speak in church. That's in chapter 14. However, 3 chapters earlier, we read, any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered, also in the context of a public kind of gathering of Christians, any woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered disgraces her head, for it is one and the same thing as having a shaved head. You see, these verses, they only make sense if we understand what was going on in the Corinthian church. That prompted Paul to tell women that if they're going to speak in church, they need a head covering on, and 3 chapters later seemed to contradict himself altogether by making this blanket statement that women should not speak at all. When we read the letters of Paul to churches or his letters to individuals, it's really important to realise that we are only hearing one side of the conversation. We have no idea what was happening in the Ephesian church to prompt Paul to give that advice to Timothy, or what was happening in the Corinthian church for Paul to give these seemingly mixed messages. We can make educated guesses based on what else is in that letter, but they will forever be that, just educated guesses. It's important to remember that when you read scholars putting forth different ideas. You've got as much of a clue as they have when you read the whole letter. So to portray these verses as giving a firm foundation for gender roles in the church is, at the very least, an irresponsible use of the Bible. And it's a use that has for decades stifled the participation of women gifted at teaching, at pastoring, and at leading. But it's much, much worse than that. This irresponsible use of these cherry-picked verses have promoted the idea that there's some kind of standard or ideal that women need to emulate, There's a box that you have to fit into. And when I think back on all the women that I've known over my life, I can't think of anyone who fits neatly into this idealised box. I know lots of women who have tried very hard to fit into it, but not many who succeeded. And if you don't fit into that box either, because you can't, or because actually you really don't want to, there's a subtle message, isn't there, coming from this quarter, that there must be something wrong with you. You're not what a woman should be. And the same goes for men, because there's an ideal that's erroneously put out there. And if you don't meet that standard, then you're not what a man should be. And if you've grown up in a church that's held strong views on what men and women should be, and that's negatively impacted you, maybe your church was steeped in purity culture, maybe your church had really strict rules about what women were allowed to do and what positions they could hold, then I've got a very strong message for you tonight. With my PhD in Biblical Studies hat on, and I almost brought it to pop it on at this point, but decided perhaps that would be distracting. But with my PhD hat on, I can confidently say that there is no such thing as biblical womanhood, any more than there is a biblical manhood. There is no fixed standard or pattern that women or men are meant to emulate or live up to found in the Bible. One of the unexpected pleasures that I've found when I've been here in the midst of a mostly queer community is that there is a complete absence of expectation around gender and gender roles. The amount of gender diversity that we have here, it leads to such a variety of gender expression that any expectations, any imposed standards of biblical womanhood and biblical manhood, we just blow those out of the water, don't we? In this place, in this congregation, gender does not determine how you should dress, what you should look like, how you should act, who you should go out with, or what roles you should have in the church. You wear black Crocs if you want. You wear sparkly shoes. You wear a tiara. You wear a kilt. No one cares. They really don't. And I find that particularly refreshing.